The First World War, I think, is, well, certainly among the most important but least understood, least studied, least known wars, least known events in all of human history, I think. And yet this great temblor still reverberates in everyday life today, especially here in the United States. So why is this war different from all other wars? I mean, we know the dates, December 7th, 1941. We know 9/11. But we don't think of April 6th, 1917 as a terribly important date in our lives. I think the biggest and most obvious reason is this is a war in which we were not attacked. And we went to war, really, I was going to say for an idea, but Woodrow Wilson, I hear him screaming in my ear, it wasn't ideas, Scott, it was ideals. And that was it. And in fighting for those ideals, this country really changed its own identity, and in so doing, changed our place in the world and therefore the world itself. Over the next 15 months after this date, April 6, 1917, this country mobilized. Some 2 million people were sent over initially, which swelled to 4 million soldiers. This was up from an army of about 150,000, a little less than that, actually. So before the First World War, the United States had a fighting force basically the size of that of Portugal's, somewhere between Portugal and Serbia. And this was the United States Army. And, of course, you needed ships and naval men to bring those soldiers over there. With all of this, you see the nation's identity begin to change. And in fighting the war, which we basically did for about 6 months as the American Expeditionary Force, you sometimes hear the United States referred to as part of the Allies. We were not among the Allies. It was very important to Woodrow Wilson and to General Pershing that we remained detached from that. We were fighting alongside the Allies, but we were a separate expeditionary force. And within those 6 months of American fighting, the armistice came about. So with all this, however, this nation really changed. A sleeping giant arose, and what had been an inward-looking isolationist country soon became, almost immediately became, a modern superpower. So why is this night different from all other nights? Well, 100 years ago, April 6th, 2017, the United States declared war against the Imperial German government. And tonight, we basically commemorate that occasion. Perhaps for a moment or two, we'll relive that war and commemorate those men who lived and died during it. And we will also celebrate some of the great American writing that emerged from that war. We all think of, and properly so, the Civil War as being really this great nurturing bed of great writing, and it is true. It's almost a miracle how much great writing came out of the Civil War. The same could be and should be said of the First World War. And one of the real pleasures, one of the real joys of working with the Library of America and a wonderful team of historians in putting this book together was to discover how much great writing there was, not just from important famous writers, the likes of Edith Wharton, but from just, quote, everyday people, from civilians, or literary civilians, from those who became soldiers and nurses and so forth. It's really remarkable, just the quality of it. And so, I think I want to say that you can't really understand the world today. You can't really understand the United States today unless you understand at least something about the First World War. And so I just want to set the table a little so we can really get into the main course of this evening and just tell you just a few of the legacies of this war that you might not think about. The first one struck me today watching the news, and we kept hearing so much about cloture. Well, few people realized that cloture was basically invented by, or it was instigated by, Woodrow Wilson during World War I, because he didn't like the way the Congress had voted on a particular, or not voted, how they were filibustering, how a dozen senators were filibustering an armed ship bill, and he was so upset about this that he came in at the start of his second term and insisted the Senate change their rules and have something called cloture, in which you could end filibusters. And so it was. So here it is, timelier than ever. But this war also gave us really the beginnings of what we now think of and call a military-industrial complex. Taxes changed radically during the First World War. Brackets that had been in the 1% and 2% range suddenly zoomed in some instances to the 67% range. There were war profits taxes. We had a federal deficit that went from $1 billion to $9 billion. So you can see the entire economy is beginning to mushroom. Something called a debt ceiling came about, in which the Treasury Department asked for this from Congress so that they didn't have to go back to Congress every time they wanted to raise money through war bonds. The United States during this period became the great breadbasket of the world. Few stop to think or consider or delight, as I do, in the fact that we got daylight savings time because of the First World War. All this came about because it was an extra hour of sunlight in which you could actually harvest the crops. Speaking of today, Russia, really the first frost in what becomes a Cold War began during the First World War, when Wilson sent a few thousand soldiers here and a few thousand soldiers there over to Russia. And it was the first time you could see real obvious distrust of the Russians and toward the United States. And of course, we had Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the 14th of which, the most important of which, was something he called a League of Nations. And this was a very Arthurian, idealistic notion he had, that every country in the world should come and sit at a table and discuss matters before they went to war. And in fact, you had to, in joining the League, you had to sign off on that you could not go to war for a certain period of time until you had discussed it and laid it out. And as a result of such a League of Nations, well, two terms really entered the parlance here. One was collective security, and the other was self-determination. Because in dividing up the world or redrawing the maps of the world, that had to be redrawn because four huge autocratic empires had fallen within just a few years of each other. The Ottomans, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, and the Romanovs. A huge chunk of the world suddenly had to be redivided. All those boundaries had to be redrawn. And so it was. And also what came out of this First World War was the leadership for a new generation. If you look at the roster of the people who were over in Versailles during the drawing up of the President of the United States, think of this, the President of the United States left America for 6 months to be there for the, I mean, if we have a president play golf for a weekend, this is scandalous. But for 6 months he left, came back only briefly to close Congress, and then went back to close what he hoped would be the treaty. And as a result of that, well, we got basically a brand new world, and we got a brand new world for the next generation, because over there were young Franklin Roosevelt, young Herbert Hoover, Christian Herter, the Dulles brothers. I mean, you could go through almost every department of the American government for the next generation, and you will find somebody who was at Versailles. Extremely important. And then after the war, we had, well, what Gertrude Stein called The Lost Generation. There was a great sense of post-war disillusionment. From that came incredible fiction, what Malcolm Cowley, the great American literary critic, called the second flowering. And it really was this incredible flowering of American writing, real American writing. For the first time, well, for maybe the second time, but well, for the first time generationally speaking, there was a whole group of writers who were writing with a new sound. Hemingway was certainly one of the leaders of that pack, but Fitzgerald and Faulkner, and I could list 20 more writers, our most significant writers between the wars, who were really writing about the war or were deeply affected by the war. And that brings us now to this book and to our evening, our panel, and so forth, which has to do with the fact that there was this incredible amount of nonfiction writing that emerged during the war. And that's the beauty and the impetus of this book, I think. It was a real pleasure and an education for me to work on it, because when I spent my 13 years writing the life of Woodrow Wilson, I often thought, I wish I had a one-volume book, just one volume, that gives a concise history of the war through 100 or 150 voices, each from a different part of that war, who could tell the story. And in essence, what I ended up doing with an incredible advisory team of historians and the wonderful staff of the Library of America, we put together this volume in which I was really something of the choral director.